Hi everyone! Today I'm going to be doing an acrylic painting onto unstretched canvas, and I'm just starting by blocking in that background and trying to get a really smooth gradient. I'm using quite a big brush, and then you can see that's actually a makeup brush that I'm trying to get rid of any distracting brush strokes with. And I'm working in several layers, so that will just help to smooth out any imperfections and make that background really smooth. So I've gridded up my canvas, and I find this one of the easiest methods, particularly for pet portraits, to make sure that all of those proportions are in the right place. This was also a bit of a skewed angle, so I wanted to make sure that everything was in the right place, that the dog was going to have a really good likeness, and that the owners would be able to instantly recognise their pet. And that's one of the most challenging things about pet portraits. It's not just that you're drawing any generic animal, it actually has to look like their pet, and trying to capture that life is one of the biggest challenges, I think, with pet portrait commissions. I'm using a white Conti pencil to sketch this out. You can use a white pastel pencil, a white charcoal pencil, anything like that, and that's much better than graphite because it won't leave really annoying pencil marks. It can erase perfectly, whereas if you use a normal graphite pencil, what can often happen is you can see those graphite lines showing through your paint. I'm starting off with the eyes. I find this quite a good place to start, just because you can get some of the life and the character of the dog into the face very early on, and it's a little bit of a confidence boost if you can get one little section looking something like. I find that to be quite useful. It doesn't always happen, especially with acrylics. A lot of my acrylic paintings can look pretty horrendous for quite a while, but on this one I decided that the eyes were so much a part of the character of the dog that I really wanted to get those established early on. And like with the background, it's a layering process. It's unlikely with acrylics that you're going to build the depth and realism that you need if you're going for photorealism or a realistic style. It's unlikely that you will be able to build the depth in just one layer. As I go onto the fur and the face, I'm just blocking in those key areas of shadow. And then on the muzzle, I'm being really conscious of the lighting. It's something that I've really tried to push in this painting, looking at the contrast between not only light and dark, but also warm and cool colours. So my first layer in acrylics is really just a map. None of this will show through, but none of this is anywhere near finished. It's just more for myself than for the viewers, so that I have a base to be able to build on as I keep layering up that paint. So now that I've got most of the base of my face, I'm starting to build up that fur texture, and I'm just doing that with a really small brush. It's a slightly damaged brush, which I find really useful because it can just get those tiny little hairs without too much effort on my part. And you want to be really careful, especially with the face fur, that you don't want it too long. You need really tiny short brush strokes. And it doesn't matter what part of fur or what kind of fur I'm working on. I always am going in the direction of the fur and also the length of the fur. So here on the ears, it's much longer fur, so my brush strokes are much longer. On the face, it's much shorter fur, so I need to be careful not to get lazy with those brush strokes and make sure I'm keeping those short. So I'm just continuing to build on that base map that I've built myself, and continuing to increase the contrast between the light and the dark, the cool and the warm colours. You can see on the right hand side of the face it's much cooler tones, especially in the shadows. I've got quite a lot of blue in there, whereas the warmer highlights on the left hand side of the face, it's more of a creamy kind of colour, and I'm really careful to keep that consistent, and where that's maybe getting a little bit lost, come back and re-establish that in those shadows and those highlights. So here you can see in a little bit more detail, hopefully, what I'm doing with that tiny brush, it's not that each brush stroke is one hair, it's that each brush stroke is several hairs. So that slightly damaged brush with the bristles are slightly splayed, which means I can make it look like I've done a lot more brush strokes than I actually have, and that just helps build the detail and texture in the fur, which is really useful. I'm also not worrying too much about my colours at this stage. I'm conscious of them, but particularly in the ears where it's quite involved and quite complicated, I'm focusing more on the contrast, and I will come through and glaze colours over the top. So here you can see I'm putting the highlights in the parts of the hair that's just catching the light. That really doesn't matter if it's a little bit too bright, because I can just tone it down later. And I'm doing exactly the same thing over the right hand ear and the face as well, just to re-establish that that is the more shadowed side. Because in my reference the right hand side of the face was really quite dark, and it's also quite a dark furred dog as well, it's really easy to lose any detail in that shadowed side, and I was quite conscious not to do that. One of the advantages of painting over photography is that you can have the artistic license to choose how much detail you want in those shadows. So in my reference there wasn't very much, so I hyped that up in just in a basic photo editor. I didn't really get much more out of it, but just by changing the contrast, changing the brightness, you can often see a little bit more detail than was first apparent. And paintings often look a lot more lifelike and a lot better than the reference if you can include those little details that maybe weren't so obvious in the photograph at first. So now I'm moving onto the body, and you can see I'm doing exactly the same thing as I did on the face. I'm first mapping in those strongest shadows, and then I'm just doing a very rough kind of where I think the main shapes are, the main highlights, main shadows. I'm glazing over the top to try and build a little bit of colour, a little bit of a base before I start building any texture, but I am still being conscious of the direction and the length of my first stroke. So even though this isn't really the layer that will be seen, I'm still being very conscious to keep those strokes consistent. And now I'm coming through with some lighter fur that is catching the light. So I tend to go a little bit darker in the first layer than what I want my final result to be. It doesn't matter if I don't too much, because I can always glaze, but I like that nice dark base to be able to build on top of. And then here you can see me glazing, just building a little bit of colour, because I was a bit lazy with what I wanted my highlight to be. I just wanted to focus on getting those main shapes in, because it was such a beautiful texture in that fur that I really wanted to capture. So for me, often one of the advantages of painting in acrylics is that it does dry so fast, so you can just focus on doing one thing at once. So first you get your main shapes in, then you start building your texture, then after that you can start thinking about your colours. And that's definitely not the only way to paint in acrylics. It's just nice to know that you've got that option if you want it. It is important, if you're painting realistically though, to make sure that your white is never, even if you use white and then glaze over it, that's fine, but don't leave your white, because that will not have very much realism in it. So you can see here I'm deepening the saturation in those lighter strands of fur that I put down. And yeah, it's just a process of carrying that on to the rest of the body, really. I build the texture, make sure that I know what I'm doing in one area, and then I can just apply the same process to the rest of the painting. And it's always encouraging when you get to this stage, because you know you don't really need to build too much detail in these areas. You need to get the texture roughly right, you need to make it look like fur, but you really don't need anywhere near as much detail as you do in the face. This is kind of the home straight. I'm just putting that shadow to give a little bit of context of the dog not just floating in space, but it is actually grounded on something. And here is the finished painting. I hope you like it. If you did, it would really help me out if you liked this video and you considered subscribing to my channel. Bye guys!